بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم الحمد لله رب العالمین و صلی الله علی محمد و اهل بیت الطیبین الطاهرین اللهم صل علی محمد و آل محمد و عجل فرجهم. Dear researchers and dear viewers, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The topic that we are with you in order to elaborate on is the issue of the communications and the techniques and also the elements of communications and the types of communications and also some inshallah techniques of a good propagation also, which we will talk about. If you remember, we were talking about different types of communication. We talked about verbal and non-verbal communication. We talked about hierarchical communication, downwards communication, upwards communication, lateral or horizontal communication. In the previous session, we also talked about the information richness and the levels of information richness, which was about 4 levels of the information richness, starting from the face-to-face communication and ending, or the last form, which was the lowest form, was the impersonal written communication. There is another type of communication that I'm going to talk about, is the issue that we classify communication into several types: personal communication, impersonal communication, interpersonal communication, and intrapersonal communication. The impersonal communication, it's better to start from this type, is the communication which is not, as a matter of fact, there is no addressee. It is a kind of communication, but this is not personal. In impersonal communication, which in upcoming sessions we will elaborate more on, it is not between two persons. In interpersonal communication, there are two sides, sender and receiver, and there is as a matter of fact, communication between these two types. Okay, for example, I communicate with one addressee and he talks to me. This is interpersonal communication between two or between a group and etc. Because interpersonal communication can be of different types, like group communication, team communication, like mass communication through the mass media and etc. This is included in the interpersonal communication. Sometimes it is intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication is the fact that you communicate with yourself. You talk and whisper to yourself. You know, this is a kind of communication. Okay, prayer is a kind of communication. It is interpersonal communication. So, if you remember, we defined the process of communication as a process which there is sender, receiver, there is a channel, there is feedback. Okay, what is the intrapersonal communication? What are the elements? In the intrapersonal communication, for example, your eyes will be the receivers. The nerves which transmit the message from your eyes to your brain, to your heart, to your body, can be the channel of the, as a matter of fact, the channel of the message which the eyes sense. Or for example, the senses that we have, I don't know, touching, smelling, seeing, okay, hearing, all of these are the senders of the messages that they send through the nerves and the neurons to the brain. And there is a receiver, which the brain is the receiver, for example, and there is a feedback. For example, the reflection that you show to that message, you suddenly stand up, you start crying, you think, you show some facial expression, you relax, you become relaxed, for example, you sleep, or for example, you start to fight, I don't know, you start to shout. These are the feedbacks of the interpersonal communication. So intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication, which was of different types, as a matter of fact, impersonal communication, which isn't, there is no person in front of you, and all of these communications are under the category of the types of communications. There is another type, or there is another classification for the communication, which is the communication networks in groups and teams. This is also important to know. You know, there are different types for communication networks. One type is wheel network, the other type is chain network, the other type circle network, and the fourth one is the all channel network. The wheel network is a network in the communication that the information flows to and from one central member. Okay, there is one wheel. At the center of this wheel there is a person who guides and conducts the other members which are in the circle. So there is one center in wheel network communication. For example, for example, the shows which are in the TVs. Okay, there is one person who is a conductor, who is the host inside the group, and he guides the others. There is one chain network which is very hierarchical, and the members communicate only with the people next to them in the sequence. This is chain network. For example, if I am ordinary staff or employee in an office, I'm not allowed to communicate with the president directly. I have to communicate, for example, with the vice president, or with the manager, or with the, for example, director, and they talk to the president. Okay, so this is very hierarchical, this type of chain network communication. There is another one point is that the wheel and the chain networks provide little interaction. But in circle network communications, the members communicate with others close to them in terms of expertise, experience, and location. This is very friendly in this type of communication, which is interpersonal communication, and it is a group and team communication. So I talk to the person beside me, and he's my colleague, for example. We are at the same level, and even if we are not at the same level from hierarchical level, we talk to each other at the level of our expertise. Maybe he is above my position in the office, but since we are at the same level of education, at the same level of expertise or experience, so we communicate with one another at one form and at the same form. So this has more interaction and more influence to the audience and to the members of the groups. And there is all channel network communication, which is the combination of the types that we mentioned. I mean the combination of the wheel network communication, chain network communication, and also circle network communication, which will be all channel network, or the combination of the types of the network communication. In this network can be more influential type of communication. So up to here, we in the previous session and today's session, we talked about four different types and classification of communications. If you remember, verbal and non-verbal, and about actually the hierarchical communication. We talked about the information richness. We also classified the communication into personal, impersonal, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. And also one other type was the network communication and different types of network communication, which was the wheel network, chain network, circle network, and all channel network. And there is one difference between the wheel network and circle network, is that in the wheel network, please remember that there is one center, and the center guides the satellites, the subordinates or the people or the circle. So like the pivotal stone, the wheel channel stands on one center, but in the circle network there is no center. All people communicate with one another according to their expertise. Now, we open up a new chapter, which is about the characteristics of effective communications. One of the important points, we can say that this is the climax of our points and our, as a matter of fact, focus on the issue of the communications, and that is the techniques or the skills that we have to be mastered for effective communication. As I mentioned in the previous discussions, it is very important to know that a good communication is a communication which is effective, which is influential, which is reciprocal. This is bilateral, not unilateral. It mustn't be monotonous. It mustn't be a communication like a flat line. It mustn't be like bullseye view. The best communication is a communication which is characterized as reciprocal and ping-pong communication. Now, when there is two sides in a effective communication, okay, there must be some skills at both sides, and I mean the sender and the receiver, and also some skills and some characteristics in the channel, the medium, and the message itself, and also in the feedback. That in this session and in our upcoming session, inshallah, we will talk about these topics and these points. The effective communication requires the message. Now I want to talk about the message, the characteristics of the message. The effective communication requires the message to be first clear and concise. The message that you send, this is a skill, this is one important point, key point. It must be very clear. It must be very concise and accurate. There are differences between these three terms: clear, concise, and accurate. Okay, when it must be first clear, that your message can be conveyed and transmitted very clearly. You have to clarify. Secondly, it must be concise and onto the point, and it must be accurate. It must be correct, and it must be right, and it must be rightful, not wrong information. So the characteristic of a message, the best message, firstly must be clear, concise, and accurate. So please memorize it. If you want to communicate with your addressee, please talk very simply, clarify, send it at the clearest form of message. One of the problems that we have in an academic atmosphere is that unfortunately, when you talk ambiguously that no one can understand, it looks like more scientific. This is very problematic. We have to pay attention that when you talk ambiguously, when you talk in a vague and in a very inaccurate form, okay, your audience will be tired soon. This is not a scientific method. Many leaders, if you pay attention to the leaders, they speak at a level that all people can understand. In a class or in a lecturing, you have to transmit and transfer your message at the form that all can understand you at the best form. The other characteristic of a message is that it must be relevant to the needs of the receiver. The needs of receiver. You must send the message which is appropriate to the needs of the receiver. For example, your receiver, your audience, is a group of physicians, for example. They are dealing with medicine, for example. They are dealing with drugs. They are dealing with, body organs. Okay, they are surgery, operation, and etc. Now you come and talk to them about mathematics. Here, the message, there is no problem in the message, but the message is not according to the need of the receiver. So this will be problematic. First of all, you have to know the level of the education of your addressee and the receiver, and the field of study of your receiver, and talk to the level of your receiver. So this is another point, and this is a very important point, that you talk at the level of the receiver and according to the need of the receiver. Okay. For example, you go to a country. For example, you go to Russia. In Russia, or for example in Germany, in these countries, rationality is very important. Okay. If you use some logical points, some philosophical arguments, if you use rational methods and understanding and argumentation, so your audience will understand you and will appreciate your message and your communication. But if in this situation you go and talk just about the issues which are not rational, they are very sentimental, they are very based on the senses, so it will be problematic. Okay, so vice versa, when you go to one country like Indonesia or Malaysia, etc. Okay, in these countries, they are mostly, as a matter of fact, interested in some spiritual things. In Japan, in China, in Korea, southeast of Asia, they are mostly and much more interested in spiritual things, not rational, for example, or philosophical. So if you talk to them about philosophical argumentations, your lecturing, your program, your communication will be in problem. So relevant to the needs of the receiver. I'm talking about the characteristics of the effective message and good message. The other point which is important in the effective message, in effective communication and the appropriate message is to be timely. It has two meanings. Firstly, it must be on time. And secondly, it must be according to the time. What do I mean? When you go to a class, or for example, when you want to have a lecture, okay, you have to be on time. Start and end on time. Okay, this is one spectrum of being timely. And the second point is that it must be relevant to the situation and to the time that you are talking, to the atmosphere. For example, don't talk about an issue, for example, in newspaper, in news agency, okay, in the news paper. Don't include some news which are belonging to last year, because this is not new. This is not a hot topic. Okay, this is a problem. Okay, when you talk about the issue which is not new right now, okay, so this is not timely. This is another meaning of being timely. The other characteristics of a good message is to be meaningful. The message that you send, in addition to be clear, concise, and accurate, in addition to be relevant to the needs of the audience, in addition to be timely, it must be meaningful. It is very relevant to the first characteristic of the message, which must be clear and concise. Meaningful, it must make sense. Don't talk about the thing that people cannot understand or make any head or tail of the message that you are sending, okay? So this will be problematic. So meaningful, send a message which has meaning to the audience, and it is understandable. For example, uh, uh, you talk to the audience, for example, that their language is not understandable for you and your language is not understandable for them. The amount of your time that you spend, it is wasting of time because he cannot understand you. So this is not meaningful. Or according to their culture, what you are talking about, in their culture it is not important, for example. It is not meaningful for them. And the last but not the least point in the characteristics of a good communication and the message is that it must be applicable to the situation. You have to talk according to the situation and keep abreast of the time. You have to talk in a way that it must be in accordance with the situation and with the physical situation, with the position of your audience, okay? For example, you are living in a country, for example, in Iran, and in Iran, in this country, there are some red lines, there are some characteristics, there are some rules, there are some guidelines that you have to pay attention. If you don't pay attention, it will be problematic. Or for example, your addressee, your audience is a very educated person. You have to talk to his or her situation, in which situation he or she is. Or for example, your addressee, your audience has lost one of his family members, for example. He has mourning ceremonies, he is very sorrowful and he is very remorseful. You go and start joking with him or her. This is the worst type of communication because it is not applicable to the situation of the receiver. So this was another session about the elements of communication, about the types of communication, and we started a new chapter which was about the characteristics of effective communication, and we started from the requirements of a good message. Thank you very much for your paying attention and for your time. I'm waiting for your feedback. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.